I walked into that boardroom still, half in a daze from my father's funeral the week before. The grief was a heavy, suffocating blanket that made every movement feel sluggish and every sound seem muffled. It felt like I was moving through deep water, my thoughts struggling to break the surface of the quiet room. I thought it was just the standard quarterly meeting to review our operational metrics, discuss the research and development pipeline, and hear our compliance director ramble about regulatory filings like he always did. I was not even wearing a tie. I wore only my father Charles's silver cufflinks, engraved with the first logo of ClearPath Diagnostics, which he had designed in our family garage 30 years ago. He gave them to me when I became the chief operating officer, telling me they were a reminder of where we started and the honest work we put into every single patent. I did not even make it to my chair at the mahogany table before Bradley Whitlow, my stepbrother, who had been recently appointed as the board chairman, cleared his throat. Bradley looked at me with a cold, rehearsed expression. He was holding a thick manila folder, and he did not even wait for me to sit down before he spoke. I looked around the room and noticed Clarence Miller, our longest-serving board member, would not meet my eyes. Neither would Judith Geller or Milton Ross, the other directors who had been around since the very beginning of the company, when we were operating out of a tiny rented office space. That was when my gut twisted. They were looking at their notebooks or staring at their coffee cups, their faces tight with a silence that felt heavy, planned, and conspiratorial. "Before we get started," Bradley said, flipping through the folder like he was reading off a lunch order or a routine utility invoice. "The board has convened a closed vote regarding executive leadership." I frowned, my hand still resting on the back of my leather chair. "What are you talking about, Bradley?" Clarence finally looked up, his face tight and his voice thin. "We appreciate your 15 years of service, Grant, but the board has decided to transition leadership." "Transition?" I said, my voice rising in the quiet room. "I have been here 15 years. I ran operations. I led sales. I directed research and development. I held this entire place together while my father was in chemotherapy. I lived in this office for months to keep our clinical testing trials on track. You cannot just transition my role. I built the core systems we use today." Bradley did not flinch. His eyes were flat, devoid of any familial warmth. "We feel your performance in the chief executive officer role lacks the maturity and public presence expected at the executive suite level." They had rehearsed it. Every word was polished, every syllable planned. Judith Geller nodded like a puppet, her lips pressed into a thin line. Milton Ross mumbled something about fiduciary duty to the shareholders, his voice barely audible. My hands were shaking in my pockets, but I kept my body still. I stared at Bradley, the stepbrother who had joined our family 10 years ago, bringing nothing to the company but a degree in finance and a talent for political maneuvering. Then Bradley reached under the edge of the table and pressed a button. It was a literal call button. Within seconds, the heavy double doors opened and 2 security guards walked in. They were wearing plain dark polo shirts, standing just behind me like I was a disgruntled temp worker who had been caught stealing office supplies, rather than the chief executive officer of the company my father had built something. I did not say a word, I did not raise my voice, and I did not argue. I looked around the room one last time. Nobody would meet my eyes, not even Sarah Jenkins from Human Resources, whom I had promoted last quarter and who owed her entire career to my father's mentorship. I nodded once, a slow, deliberate gesture, and turned toward the door. The walk out of the building felt like a mile. I passed through the open floor plan, where engineers, researchers, and administrative assistants froze mid-keystroke. These were people I had hired, people I had trained and worked alongside in the clean rooms. Not one of them moved. Not one of them spoke. They just watched as the 2 security guards escorted me to the glass entrance doors. I stepped outside into the cool autumn air. The breeze hit my face, and I reached into my pocket, my fingers brushing against the silver cufflinks. I stood on the sidewalk outside that building for 5 full minutes, looking up at the letters of ClearPath Diagnostics mounted on the concrete facade before I finally walked away. I did not know where I was going, but I knew I could not go home yet. When I finally reached my house, I walked straight to the kitchen and poured 3 fingers of scotch. I did not even sit down. I just stood there in the quiet house, staring out the window at the gray sky, and drank. The burning in my throat was the only thing that felt real. For a full week, I did the same thing. I woke up angry, I spent the day staring at the walls, and I went to bed angry. Every time I thought about the boardroom, about the smug look on Bradley's face, I felt like a fool. I had walked straight into their trap, wearing my father's cufflinks like a naive boy who thought hard work and loyalty actually meant something in a corporate structure. But as the days passed, the anger stopped being a blinding fog and turned into something else. It became a cold, sharp focus. They thought they had buried my father, and then they thought they had buried me. But they did not realize that they had only cleared the field for a war. Every corner of the building held a memory of my father. I remembered the winter when the heating system failed, and he and I spent the night wrapping the delicate laboratory equipment in blankets, drinking soup from a thermos while he explained the principles of microfluidic assays. He did not care about the valuation or the stock price. He cared about the integrity of the data and the accuracy of the diagnostics. To him, a single false positive was a personal failure. Now, the board was ready to hand all that dedication over to a conglomerate that viewed patients as recurring revenue streams. The cufflinks I wore were a small anchor to that past, a physical connection to the man who had taught me how to analyze data, see, and trust the science. When Bradley cleared his throat, the sound was thin and dry, like dry autumn leaves scraping across concrete. After a week of isolation, I knew I needed information. I called Jason Fletcher, a close friend from my university days, who had gone through a brutal divorce 2 years ago. His former wife had attempted to hide their joint assets across 5 different offshore accounts in 3 states, and Jason had hired a private investigator to dig them up. He gave me the number of Dwight Eldridge, a retired detective who specialized in corporate forensics and asset tracking. I met Dwight the next afternoon at a small, dimly lit diner off Interstate 10. He was a quiet, thick-set man with graying hair who looked like he had seen every kind of human greed imaginable. He set a cardboard box and a thick folder on the table between us, alongside 2 cups of black coffee. I did not have to dig very deep, Dwight said, taking a sip of his coffee. Your stepbrother and his friends on the board were incredibly sloppy. They used a shared private server for their communications, thinking it was secure, but the encryption was outdated. My associate cracked it in 48 hours. He slid the folder toward me. I opened it and began to read. The emails went back 7 months, to a time when my father Charles was still alive and undergoing cancer treatment in the hospital. The subject lines were clinical, transition strategies, asset maximization, and post-founder contingencies. Clarence Miller was coaching Bradley on how to align the board votes. In one chain, Bradley had written about me, calling me the little prince who thought he inherited a kingdom. He wrote that I was too focused on research and patient testing, and that I did not understand how to unlock the true value of the company's assets. But the personal insults were nothing compared to what I found on the next page. Dwight points to a series of financial ledgers and draft contracts. They are not just trying to run the company, Dwight explained. They are planning to gut it. They have been negotiating a secret agreement to transfer our entire diagnostics patent pipeline to a competitor called Aegis Therapeutics. Aegis? I asked, my chest tightening. They are a massive conglomerate known for buying up smaller biotech companies, raising the prices of their diagnostics tests by 500% and laying off the staff. Exactly, Dwight said. The deal is already structured. As soon as the Securities and Exchange Commission filings clear and the transition of leadership is complete, they will license the core technology to Aegis for an 8-figure sum. The board members are getting massive payouts. Clarence is lined up for a consulting contract worth $10 million. Judith and Milton are getting golden parachutes, and Bradley is getting a seat on the Aegis advisory board. They were going to destroy everything my father had spent his life building, selling our research to a predatory corporation that would exploit patients for profit. I went home that night and spread the documents across my kitchen table. I needed a legal weapon, something that could stop them in their tracks before the Aegis deal was finalized. I opened the corporate bylaws of ClearPath Diagnostics, which had not been updated since the company went public 10 years ago. I spent hours reading through the dense legal jargon, my eyes scanning the sections on board authority, shareholder voting, and executive removals. That was when I found it. Buried deep in Section 11.3.4 was a legacy clause that my father had insisted on, including when the company transitioned from a private partnership. The clause stated that any shareholder or group of shareholders acting in unison who held 75% or more of the voting control of the outstanding shares could override any action taken by the board of directors. The clause specifically noted that this power was absolute, requiring no board approval, veto, or appeal. I checked my father's estate planning documents. Charles had left me 21.5% of the company's shares. It was a significant block, but it was far from the 75% required to activate the clause. I stared at the numbers on my legal pad. I needed another 53.5% of the company. It seemed like an impossible mountain to climb. The rest of the shares were held by institutional investors, former employees, and early venture capitalists who had funded our first clinical trials. I texted Dwight, "We are going to need to find every shareholder who ever worked for my father." Dwight replied within minutes, "I will start building the list." I sat back in my chair, looking at the silver cufflinks resting on the table. My stepbrother thought he had won because he had the board of directors. But he forgot that a company is not just a boardroom. It is the people who built the foundation. I was going to find them, and I was going to buy back our company, one share at a time. The diagnostics pipeline they were trying to steal was the result of a decade of intensive research. It was a molecular panel that could identify bacterial pathogens in under 30 minutes, a breakthrough that had saved countless patients in intensive care units from sepsis. My father and I had filed the original utility patents in Delaware, making sure the claims were written broadly enough to prevent competitors from designing around our technology. The Aegis agreement was not just a license, it was a complete transfer of the underlying patents and the proprietary master cells. It was an intellectual property heist dressed up in corporate language. I began my campaign the next morning. I sat at my desk and drew a circle around the first name on my list, Dr. Ronald Prasad. Ronald was our director of diagnostic research and had worked alongside my father for 12 years. He was a brilliant scientist who detested corporate politics, spending all his time in the labs. I texted him, asking to meet after hours. We met in his office at the research facility long after the administration staff had gone home. The blinds were drawn, and the only light came from a single desk lamp. "Grant," Ronald said, shaking my hand warmly, "what they did to you was a disgrace. Your father would have been outraged." "I know, Ronald. But I am not here to complain. I am here to stop them." I laid the folder of emails and the Aegis Therapeutics draft agreement on his desk. Ronald put on his reading glasses and began to flip through the pages. I watched his face darken as he read Bradley's plans to license our diagnostics pipeline, which would lead to the shutdown of our research division. "They want to turn our lab into a warehouse for Aegis," Ronald said, his voice trembling with anger. "This diagnostics test took us 10 years to develop. It saves lives. They want to turn it into a cash cow for a group of corporate raiders. I need your help, Ronald. Do you still hold your shares?" "Yes," he said. "My original option grants vested after year 10. I hold 2.1% of the outstanding stock. I need you to sign a voting trust agreement, giving me control of those shares. I will not sell them, and I will use them to reclaim the company." Ronald did not hesitate. He pulled a pen from his pocket. "Where do I sign?" With Ronald's 2.1%, I was at 23.6%. It was a start, but the road ahead was long. I spent the next 3 weeks traveling across the country, meeting with early investors and retired employees who still held small blocks of stock. I drove 2 hours to a diner in Washington to meet a retired laboratory technician who held 0.5% of the company in a retirement account. I flew to Florida to meet a retired chemist who held 1.8%. I even tracked down Cesar Alvarez, our former maintenance supervisor, who was now working in Arizona. Cesar held 0.25% that he had received during our first employee stock option program 15 years ago. I did not make grand speeches. I did not promise them massive returns. Instead, I sat across from them in diners and living rooms and showed them the evidence of what Bradley and the board were doing. I showed them how the board was planning to dismantle the company to secure their own payouts. The response was almost always the same. These were people who remembered my father. They remembered how Charles had helped them pay for their children's medical expenses, or how he had stood by them when a research trial failed. One by one, they signed the voting trust agreements. A retired scientist in Seattle handed me his signed paperwork, his eyes shining. Your father gave me a job when no other lab would hire me after my previous company collapsed. If you are fighting to save his work, I am with you. While I was collecting these signatures, I worked with my attorney, Diana Thornton. Diana was a sharp, meticulous corporate lawyer who helped me set up a series of anonymous shell companies registered in Delaware. These entities began to quietly purchase shares of ClearPath Diagnostics on the open market, buying small blocks of 0.5% or less to avoid triggering any regulatory reporting requirements. We chose nondescript names for these companies, registering them through a filing service that kept our association completely private. It was a slow, grueling process. I spent my nights updating a whiteboard in my guest bedroom, adding up the fractions of percentages. Ronald Prasad's 2.1, Cesar Alvarez's 0.25%, the retired chemist's 1.8, and the steady stream of open market purchases. By the end of the first month, the number on my whiteboard reached 48%. We were getting closer, but we were still far from the 75% threshold. I was exhausted. My savings were depleted from buying shares, and the board was moving closer to finalizing the Aegis deal. I knew I needed a distraction to buy myself more time. In Florida, I sat on the porch of a small house surrounded by orange trees, talking to Mrs. Gable, the retired chemist. She remembered my father Charles bringing fresh pastries to the lab every Friday morning, and she kept her small stock certificate in a metal safe in her closet. She signed the voting trust without even looking at the Aegis emails. If you are Charles's son and you are fighting for the labs, that is all I need to know, she said. In Arizona, Cesar Alvarez welcomed me into his home, his hands calloused from years of working on our laboratory ventilation systems. He remembered my father helping him finance his daughter's education. He signed the trust with a quiet nod, saying that my father was the only boss who ever treated him like an equal. To prevent the board from completing the Aegis Therapeutics deal before I was ready, I needed to create a massive diversion. I decided to build a fake competitor that would look like a significant threat to ClearPath Diagnostics. Diana Thornton helped me register a new entity called Pathkin Health. We set up a basic website, registered a corporate phone number that routed to a virtual receptionist, and established a small physical office space just 4 blocks from our headquarters. We made sure the paperwork looked professional, but the company had no products, no employees, and no actual laboratory. The office was decorated with a few cheap desks and a rented copy machine, just in case the board sent scouts to verify the operations. I then traveled to a major biotechnology conference in San Diego. I made sure to wear a tailored suit, spent my evenings standing near the corporate executives at the hotel lounge, and dropped hints about my new venture. I am working on something new, I told an industry recruiter over a drink. We are developing a next-generation diagnostic platform that will render current immunology pipelines obsolete. It is a private project, and we are moving very fast. I let the rumor hang in the air. 2 days later, the recruiter called one of my old associates at ClearPath Diagnostics to ask if they were aware that the former chief executive officer was building a rival lab nearby. The rumor spread exactly as I planned. Within a week, the board went into a panic. They assumed I was launching a competitor to steal their researchers and render our existing patents useless before they could sell them to Aegis. Clarence Miller sent an urgent email to the board, which Dwight Eldridge intercepted. "We need to monitor Grant's activities," Clarence wrote. "If he launches a competing platform, it will destroy the valuation of our diagnostics pipeline, and Aegis will back out of the deal." The board scrambled. They instructed their legal department to send out company-wide reminders about non-disclosure agreements and threatened to prosecute any employee who communicated with me. They spent their days holding emergency meetings with external counsel trying to draft a lawsuit against Pathkin Health for intellectual property theft. While they were busy chasing a ghost company, I was quietly continuing my acquisition of shares. The board was so focused on the threat of Pathgen Health that they failed to notice the steady increase in trading volume of our stock, which was being bought up by Diana's shell companies. We kept our buying patterns irregular, purchasing on down days and spreading the trades across 12 different accounts. By the middle of the second month, I reached 68%. But we had exhausted the list of small shareholders, and the open market supply was drying up. I needed one final, massive block of shares to push me over the 75% line. I decided to leak one more rumor. I had Ronald Prasad mention to a colleague that Pathkin Health was in discussions to hire Dr. Eleanor Kincaid, our lead researcher and the chief architect of our immunology pipeline. Eleanor was a brilliant scientist, and everyone in the industry knew that without her, ClearPath's research would grind to a halt. The rumor was a hand grenade. The board immediately called an emergency session. They summoned Eleanor to the boardroom and demanded to know if she was leaving. She denied it, of course, because she had never spoken to me about Pathgen. But the board remained deeply suspicious of her claims. They became convinced that the company was collapsing from within. In their panic, several early institutional investors who held shares began to worry that the Aegis deal would fall through and the stock would crash. They decided to dump their holdings. This was the opportunity I had been eagerly awaiting. Diana's shell companies immediately bought the blocks of shares as they were placed on the market. I was sitting in my kitchen, staring at the computer screen, as the final trade confirmations came through. Diana called me, her voice sharp with excitement. "We got them, Grant. The final trades have cleared." I looked at the spreadsheet. Our total voting control was now 75.08%. We had crossed the line. The board of directors no longer had the final say. I had the power to rewrite the future of the company. At the San Diego Convention Center, the air was filled with the hum of hundreds of biotech representatives pitching their platforms. I stood by the exhibit hall, speaking to venture capitalists and industry analysts, making sure to drop the name Pathgen Health in every conversation. I knew that the industry was a small, gossipy circle, and any mention of a new startup funded by the former chief executive officer of ClearPath would make its way back to Bradley within hours. The board's legal team immediately began sending cease and desist letters to my home address, accusing me of violating my non-compete agreements, which only proved that they were completely distracted by the smokescreen. Our technical team reported that the board was spending hours in the server rooms, auditing data logs to see if there was any security leak. They even hired an external IT security firm to scan their systems, convinced that Pathgen had hacked their databases. This constant internal chaos was exactly what we needed to keep them busy and drain their focus. The next morning, I sent a certified letter to every member of the board of directors, calling for an immediate special meeting of the shareholders. Under Section 11.3.4 of the corporate bylaws, I was exercising my right as the controlling shareholder to convene the meeting. I also had Diana file our Schedule 13D with the Securities and Exchange Commission, disclosing my 75.08% ownership stake. The news hit the financial wires within an hour. Bloomberg ran a headline, "Ousted founder's son amasses controlling stake in ClearPath Diagnostics." The stock market reacted instantly, with the share price dropping 9 points as investors tried to understand what was happening. My stepfather, George Whitlow, called my mother's house in a panic, and she handed the phone to me. "What are you doing, Grant?" Bradley's father demanded, his voice cracking with tension. "You are destroying the company. You are going to ruin Bradley's career and wipe out our family's investments. Your father would never have wanted this kind of public circus." My father would never have wanted his stepson to steal his company and sell it to a group of corporate raiders, I replied coldly. I am protecting his legacy. It is over, George. I hung up before he could answer. The boardroom looked exactly the same as it had 3 months ago. The same brushed steel conference table, the same black leather chairs, and the same abstract painting that Bradley had hung on the wall. But this time I walked in wearing my father's burgundy tie, which was slightly worn at the edges but carried a weight that no expensive suit could match. Bradley was standing at the head of the table, his face red and his hands shaking. Clarence Miller, Judith Geller, and Milton Ross were already seated, their faces pale and their eyes fixed on the door. "This is an unauthorized intrusion," Bradley shouted as I entered. "You are not an officer of this company, and you have no right to be in this room. I have already called security." "Sit down, Bradley," I said, my voice quiet and steady. I reached into my briefcase and pulled out 2 thick packets of documents, dropping them onto the steel table with a heavy thud. "The first packet is the certified registry of our outstanding shares," I said. "As of this morning, my coalition controls 80.3% of the voting shares of ClearPath Diagnostics. The second packet is the legal opinion from outside counsel, confirming that under Section 11.3.4 of our bylaws, I have the absolute authority to reconstitute the board and reverse any previous board decisions." Bradley stared at the papers, his mouth opening and closing, but no sound coming out. Right on cue, the double doors opened and Diana Thornton wheeled in 2 large carts stacked with 6 file boxes. "And this," I continued, "is the evidence we have gathered over the past 3 months. We have a copy of every email from your private server. We have the wire transfers to your offshore accounts in the Cayman Islands. We have the draft contract with Aegis Therapeutics, showing that you plan to transfer the company's core intellectual property in exchange for personal kickbacks." Clarence Miller sank back in his chair, his face losing all color. Judith Geller put her hands over her face, whispering a quiet prayer. "This is a clear violation of your fiduciary duties of loyalty and care under Section 144 of the Delaware General Corporation Law," I said. "It is also a violation of the Defend Trade Secrets Act under Title 18. Section 1836 of the United States Code, since you attempted to transfer proprietary research without authorization. And because you used insider information to structure your stock options prior to the Aegis announcement, you are in direct violation of Rule 10b-5 of the Securities Exchange Act of 1934. I looked at Clarence, Judith, and Milton. "Here is how this is going to go," I said. "You are going to sign your resignations from this board immediately. If you do, I will not file civil lawsuits against you for corporate waste and breach of fiduciary duty." "What about criminal charges?" Clarence asked, his voice shaking. "That is not my decision," I said. "I have already delivered these boxes of evidence to the Securities and Exchange Commission and the Department of Justice. They will make their own determinations." Judith stood up first, her hands trembling as she grabbed her purse. "I want to speak to my attorney." "You should," Diana Thornton said, her voice cool and professional. "You will need one." Judith walked out of the room, followed quickly by Clarence and Milton. They left their folders behind, their corporate careers over in a matter of minutes. That left only Bradley. He remained seated at the table, staring at me with a mixture of hatred and disbelief. "You think you won, Grant?" he spat. "You think this makes you Charles? You are just a scientist who got lucky with a few numbers." "I do not need to be my father, Bradley. I just need to protect what he built from people like you." I nodded toward the door. The security guards walked in. They were the same 2 guards who had escorted me out 3 months ago, but this time they were looking at Bradley. "Please escort the former chairman from the building," I said. Bradley stood up, kicking his chair back. "Do not touch me," he snarled at the guards. He turned and walked out, his steps loud and angry in the hallway. The room was silent. Diana and I were left alone in the large, empty boardroom. I walked to the head of the table, pulled out the leather chair, and sat down. The next morning, we began the work of rebuilding. I appointed Frederick Dempsey, our former chief financial officer who had worked with my father for 20 years, to reclaim his old seat. Ronald Prasad took over as our head of research and development, with full control over the laboratory budget. We immediately terminated the Aegis Therapeutics agreement, ensuring that our diagnostics pipeline remained ours. I sent a letter to every employee, printed on paper and delivered to their desks, explaining that the corporate crisis was over and that our focus would return to developing diagnostics that save lives. A few days later, my mother called to tell me she had filed for divorce from George Whitlow. She did not want to be associated with the fraud that Bradley and his father had attempted to pull off. It is late now, past midnight. I am sitting in my father's old office, looking out the window at the city lights. The silver cufflinks are resting on the desk next to my coffee cup. On the shelf behind me is a new framed photo of our research team, all wearing the original logo pins of ClearPath Diagnostics. We got it back, Father. The company is whole. The thieves are gone, and the future is ours to build. The recovery of the company was not an overnight victory. We had to renegotiate terms with our distributors, reassure our clinical trial partners that our leadership was stable, and rebuild the morale of the research staff who had been walking on eggshells for months. But the energy in the building had changed. The silence was no longer heavy and suspicious. It was the quiet of people focused on the work. Frederick Dempsey spent his first week auditing the corporate accounts, uncovering several other unauthorized transactions that Bradley had authorized during his short tenure. We presented those findings to the federal investigators as well, ensuring that the legal case against the former board was airtight.